Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today as we examine one of the most pressing humanitarian crises of our time. What we're witnessing in Gaza represents not just a news headline, but a profound human tragedy that demands our careful attention and thoughtful analysis over the next 3 hours together. Let me begin by setting the context for what we're seeing unfold. The image of another home collapsing in Gaza, while Israel continues to block shelter supplies, is not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern that has been developing and intensifying, and to understand where this might lead, we need to first understand how we arrived at this moment. The immediate situation we're addressing involves the systematic destruction of residential infrastructure in Gaza, coupled with what many international observers are calling a blockade on essential humanitarian supplies, specifically materials needed for shelter reconstruction. This combination creates what humanitarian experts describe as a compounding crisis, where each element multiplies the severity of the others. When we talk about homes caving in, we're not simply discussing buildings. We're talking about the erasure of family histories, the destruction of communities, and the displacement of people who often have nowhere else to go. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, with approximately 2 million people living in a space of just 365 square kilometers. When homes are destroyed in such a confined area, the ripple effects are immediate and severe. Now, let's consider the blocking of shelter supplies. This isn't just about construction materials in the abstract sense. We're talking about concrete, steel reinforcement bars, timber, roofing materials, and the basic components that allow people to have protection from the elements. The stated reason from Israeli authorities has typically centered on security concerns, the argument being that materials like concrete and steel could potentially be diverted for military purposes, specifically tunnel construction or fortification building. However, this security rationale collides directly with humanitarian imperatives. International humanitarian law is quite clear that civilian populations have the right to adequate shelter, and that parties to a conflict have obligations to allow humanitarian assistance to reach civilian populations. This creates a legal and moral tension that sits at the heart of this crisis. Let me walk you through several possible outcomes as this situation continues to unfold. The first scenario, and perhaps the most optimistic, involves international pressure leading to a breakthrough in negotiations. We could see increased diplomatic engagement from regional powers, perhaps Egypt, Jordan, or the United Arab Emirates, working in concert with European nations and the United States to broker some form of agreement that allows for monitored delivery of construction materials. In this scenario, we might witness the establishment of what's sometimes called a dual-use materials inspection regime. This would involve international monitors, possibly under United Nations auspices, who would verify that construction materials entering Gaza are indeed used for civilian reconstruction rather than military purposes. This isn't unprecedented. Similar mechanisms have been attempted before, though with mixed results. The pathway to this outcome would likely involve several steps. First, there would need to be a recognition by all parties that the current situation is unsustainable. Second, we'd need to see a willingness to compromise, with Palestinian authorities in Gaza accepting intrusive monitoring in exchange for material access, and Israeli authorities accepting that their security concerns can be addressed through verification rather than total prohibition. But let's be realistic about the challenges here. Trust between the parties is at historic lows. Previous attempts at inspection regimes have broken down amid accusations of violations and bad faith. The political leadership on both sides faces domestic pressures that make compromise difficult. In Israel, there's significant public concern about security, especially regarding tunnel threats. In Gaza, accepting external monitoring of how materials are used could be portrayed as a loss of sovereignty. The second scenario is considerably darker, and I say this with no satisfaction whatsoever. We could see a continued deterioration of the situation, with more homes collapsing, either from previous damage that hasn't been repaired, from ongoing military operations, or simply from the structural instability that comes when buildings are damaged and cannot be properly maintained. In this trajectory, we would likely witness a deepening humanitarian catastrophe. More families would be displaced. The existing shelter infrastructure, already strained beyond capacity, would face impossible demands. We might see increased mortality not from direct violence, but from exposure, disease, and the breakdown of basic social services that depend on stable housing. This scenario doesn't happen in isolation. It would almost certainly trigger increased international condemnation, potentially leading to various forms of sanctions or international legal actions. We could see cases brought before the International Criminal Court, increased economic pressure on Israel from some nations, and growing isolation in international forums. However, history suggests that such measures, even when implemented, rarely produce immediate changes on the ground. The humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza would face impossible choices in this scenario. With limited resources and growing needs, they would have to make devastating decisions about who receives assistance and who doesn't. We might see the emergence of a semi-permanent population of internally displaced persons living in makeshift camps or with host families, creating secondary pressures on an already fragile social fabric. A third possible outcome involves escalation into renewed large-scale conflict. The deteriorating humanitarian situation could serve as a catalyst for renewed violence. Armed groups in Gaza might launch attacks, arguing that they have no choice given the humanitarian situation. This could trigger Israeli military responses, potentially leading to another large-scale confrontation similar to what we've seen in previous years. The mechanics of such escalation are unfortunately well established. Rocket fire from Gaza towards Israeli population centers would likely be met with airstrikes and possibly ground operations. We would see casualty numbers rise sharply on both sides, though the asymmetry in capabilities means that Palestinian casualties would likely be far higher. International efforts would focus on achieving a ceasefire, but as we've seen before, such ceasefires often come only after significant destruction and loss of life. Now let me turn to a fourth scenario that doesn't receive as much attention but is worth considering. We could see what I'll call a slow-motion adaptation, where the situation neither dramatically improves nor explodes into large-scale conflict, but instead persists in a kind of grinding stalemate. In this outcome, people in Gaza would find ways to survive with minimal shelter, using whatever materials they can scavenge or smuggle in through tunnel networks or other informal channels. This scenario might sound less dramatic than the others, but in many ways it represents the most insidious outcome. It would mean the normalization of substandard living conditions, where an entire population gradually adapts to circumstances that should be considered unacceptable by any humanitarian standard. Children would grow up never knowing adequate housing. Health conditions would deteriorate gradually rather than catastrophically. The psychological toll would be immense but largely invisible to the outside world. International attention, always finite and fickle, would likely drift to other crises. News organizations would move on to other stories. The situation would become what humanitarian workers grimly call a forgotten emergency, where suffering continues but no longer generates headlines or political will for change. Let me now discuss the key stakeholders in this crisis and their respective positions, because understanding who has influence and what they want is crucial to predicting outcomes. First, the Israeli government faces multiple competing pressures. From a security perspective, there are legitimate concerns about materials being diverted for military purposes. The tunnel networks that have been constructed in Gaza over the years required substantial amounts of concrete and other building materials. Israeli military and intelligence assessments continue to emphasize this threat. However, the Israeli government also faces international pressure, particularly from allies who are increasingly uncomfortable with the humanitarian situation. The United States, historically Israel's closest ally, has shown signs of growing unease, with various American officials publicly calling for greater humanitarian access. European nations, while maintaining security cooperation with Israel, have been more vocal in their criticism of the blockade policies. Domestically, Israeli public opinion is complex. There's broad support for security measures, but there's also a segment of Israeli society that questions whether the current approach is sustainable or moral. These voices, while perhaps not dominant, represent an important pressure point. The Palestinian authorities in Gaza operate under their own set of constraints. They face the impossible task of governing a territory under blockade while trying to maintain services for a population of 2 million. The blocking of construction materials directly undermines their ability to govern effectively, which in turn affects their legitimacy and stability. These authorities also navigate complex relationships with regional powers that provide various forms of support. Their decisions are not made in isolation but in consultation with allies and supporters who have their own interests and priorities. Some of these external actors may see value in maintaining tension as leverage in broader regional dynamics, while others genuinely seek to alleviate the humanitarian situation. The international community, particularly the United Nations and its various agencies, plays a crucial role. Organizations like the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the World Health Organization, and various non-governmental humanitarian groups provide essential services in Gaza. They operate in an incredibly difficult environment, trying to meet humanitarian needs while navigating the political complexities that surround every aspect of their work. These organizations serve multiple functions. They provide direct assistance, obviously, but they also serve as witnesses and advocates, documenting conditions and calling attention to humanitarian concerns. Their reports and assessments carry weight in international forums and can influence policy decisions by member states. Regional powers have their own interests at stake. Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza and controls the Rafah crossing, has significant influence over what can enter the territory. Egyptian policy has varied over time, sometimes allowing relatively free movement and other times imposing tight restrictions. Current Egyptian policy seems to balance between humanitarian concerns and security interests, particularly regarding militancy in the Sinai Peninsula. Other regional actors, including Qatar, Turkey, and Iran, provide various forms of support to Gaza, whether financial assistance, political backing, or in some cases military support. Each of these countries has its own motivations, which may align with humanitarian concerns but are also tied to broader regional ambitions and competitions. Let me address now the legal and moral frameworks that apply to this situation, because these frameworks, while often not enforced in practice, do shape the discourse and can influence long-term outcomes. International humanitarian law, specifically the Fourth Geneva Convention, establishes clear obligations regarding the protection of civilian populations in occupied or conflict-affected territories. There are specific provisions about the right to adequate shelter, the obligation to allow humanitarian assistance, and the protection of civilian infrastructure. The principle of proportionality in international law requires that military actions be proportionate to the military advantage sought and that civilian harm be minimized. When we're talking about blocking shelter supplies that affect an entire civilian population, questions of proportionality become central to the legal analysis. Various United Nations resolutions have addressed the situation in Gaza specifically, calling for the lifting of restrictions on humanitarian goods. While these resolutions may not have direct enforcement mechanisms, they represent the collective will of the international community and can shape diplomatic pressure and policy decisions. Human rights law adds another layer of applicable legal framework. The right to adequate housing is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The blocking of materials necessary for housing arguably violates these rights, though enforcement of economic and social rights has always been more challenging than enforcement of civil and political rights. From a moral philosophy perspective, we can analyze this situation through various ethical frameworks. A utilitarian analysis would look at the total harm being caused and weigh the security benefits of blocking materials against the humanitarian costs. Given the scale of suffering in Gaza, a purely utilitarian calculation would likely favor allowing greater access to construction materials, with appropriate monitoring. A rights-based approach would emphasize the fundamental rights of individuals to shelter and security, rights that should not be violated even for broader security goals. This framework would likely be more critical of blanket restrictions on materials, emphasizing that collective punishment of a civilian population is never justified. A virtue ethics approach would ask what a virtuous state would do in these circumstances. It would consider qualities like compassion, justice, and prudence, and would likely conclude that a virtuous approach would find ways to address security concerns without causing such extensive civilian suffering. Now, let me turn to the question of precedent and historical context, because this situation didn't emerge in a vacuum. Gaza has been under various forms of blockade or restriction since 2007, when the current governing authorities there took control after winning elections and subsequent internal conflict. The rationale for restrictions has remained relatively consistent, focused on preventing the importation of weapons and materials that could be used for military purposes. Previous rounds of conflict have each left destruction in their wake, and the pattern has been relatively consistent. Major military operations cause extensive damage, followed by international pledges to support reconstruction, followed by slow or blocked implementation of reconstruction efforts due to restrictions on materials. This cycle has repeated several times over the past 15 years. Each iteration of this cycle leaves the situation worse than before. Infrastructure that was damaged in previous conflicts often hasn't been fully repaired when new damage occurs. The cumulative effect is a steady deterioration of living conditions, with housing stock aging and inadequate, water and sanitation systems failing, and electricity remaining available only intermittently. Looking at comparable situations elsewhere in the world can provide some insights, though every conflict has its unique characteristics. In Syria, we've seen how the blocking of humanitarian supplies can be used as a weapon of war, with devastating consequences for civilian populations. In Yemen, blockades and restrictions on imports have contributed to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, including widespread famine. These precedents suggest that when civilian access to basic necessities is restricted for extended periods, the humanitarian consequences are predictable and severe. They also suggest that such situations tend to be stable in the worst sense, persisting for years or even decades unless there's a fundamental change in the political situation. Let me now discuss the economic dimensions of this crisis, because the inability to rebuild homes is just one aspect of a broader economic catastrophe in Gaza. The blockade on construction materials is part of a wider set of restrictions that have devastated the Gaza economy. Unemployment rates in Gaza are among the highest in the world, hovering around 50% overall and much higher among young people. The construction sector, which in a normal economy would be a major source of employment, is essentially non-functional because of material restrictions. This creates a vicious cycle where people lack both adequate shelter and the economic means to improve their situation even if materials were available. The economic impact extends beyond just the construction sector. The general climate of instability and restriction discourages any form of business investment. Productive capacity has been degraded through repeated conflicts that have damaged factories, farms, and commercial infrastructure. Even when businesses want to operate, they face severe constraints on importing inputs and exporting products. The long-term economic development of any region requires basic infrastructure, and housing is foundational to that infrastructure. Without adequate housing, you cannot have a stable workforce. Without a stable workforce, you cannot have economic development. Without economic development, you cannot generate the tax revenue needed for public services. The blocking of construction materials thus has effects that cascade through every aspect of society. Some economic analysts have described Gaza as an example of what they call deliberate de-development, where policies systematically undermine the productive capacity of an economy. Whether intentional or not, the effect has been to create economic dependency, with the majority of the population relying on humanitarian assistance rather than being able to support themselves through employment. This economic dimension is crucial to understanding possible future scenarios. Even if construction materials were suddenly allowed in tomorrow, the economic resources to purchase those materials and pay for reconstruction are largely absent. Reconstruction would require massive external funding, and donor fatigue is a real phenomenon in protracted crises. Let me address now the psychological and social impacts of this crisis, aspects that often receive less attention than the physical destruction but are equally important for understanding the long-term trajectory. The psychological impact of living in inadequate shelter, particularly for children, is well documented in research on refugee and displaced populations. Lack of stable housing is associated with increased rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. For children growing up in Gaza, many of whom have experienced multiple rounds of conflict and years of housing instability, the developmental impacts can be profound. There's also what psychologists call toxic stress, the kind of chronic, uncontrollable stress that comes from living in persistent insecurity without adequate shelter or basic services. This type of stress affects brain development in children and has been linked to long-term health problems, difficulties in learning and emotional regulation, and increased risk of mental health disorders. The social fabric of communities is strained when families cannot maintain stable homes. Extended family networks, traditionally a source of support and resilience in Palestinian society, become stretched to breaking point when multiple families are forced to crowd into inadequate spaces. Social tensions increase. The ability of communities to function cohesively is undermined. There's also a temporal dimension to the psychological impact. In the early stages of a crisis, people often display remarkable resilience, finding ways to cope and maintain hope that the situation will improve. But as a crisis becomes protracted, as years turn into decades, that resilience can erode. We see increased rates of despair, loss of hope, and what's sometimes called learned helplessness, where people stop believing that their actions can improve their circumstances. This psychological dimension has political implications as well. Populations living in such conditions may become more susceptible to extremist ideologies that offer simple explanations and promise dramatic change. Alternatively, they may become politically disengaged, focused purely on daily survival rather than broader political objectives. Both outcomes pose challenges for any eventual peace process. Now I want to examine the media and information dimension of this crisis, because how this situation is understood and portrayed in different parts of the world significantly affects the political pressure for change. In much of the Western media, coverage of Gaza tends to be episodic rather than continuous. The situation receives intense attention during periods of acute conflict but fades from view during periods of chronic crisis. A home collapsing makes the news when it's part of a larger escalation, but the daily grinding deterioration of housing stock is harder to capture in headlines. This episodic coverage affects public awareness and political will. When Gaza is in the news, there may be calls for action and expressions of concern. When it fades from the headlines, other issues take priority. This creates a pattern where the situation is addressed in crisis mode rather than through sustained, preventive engagement. Different media ecosystems portray the situation very differently. In some Middle Eastern media, the focus is heavily on the humanitarian catastrophe and Israeli responsibility. In Israeli media, coverage often emphasizes security concerns and threats. In Western media, there's often an attempt at balance that can sometimes obscure the asymmetries of power and impact. Social media has added new dimensions to this information landscape. Images and videos of destruction circulate rapidly, creating moments of viral attention. But social media's appetite for constant novelty means that even dramatic imagery can quickly become normalized, losing its power to shock or mobilize. The information environment also includes deliberate disinformation and propaganda from various sides. This makes it challenging for observers to get an accurate picture of the situation. Claims and counterclaims circulate, and in the fog of competing narratives, the underlying humanitarian reality can become obscured. Let me turn now to the question of what international mechanisms exist or could be developed to address this crisis. We need to think about both immediate humanitarian responses and longer-term structural solutions. In the immediate term, there are several possible interventions that international actors could pursue. One is increased funding for humanitarian operations, though as I mentioned earlier, funding alone cannot solve the problem if materials cannot enter Gaza. More crucial would be diplomatic pressure to allow greater access for construction materials. This diplomatic pressure could take various forms. It could involve bilateral negotiations, with key allies of Israel making clear that continued blocking of humanitarian supplies is damaging to their relationship. It could involve multilateral action through the United Nations Security Council, though this has historically been blocked by veto-wielding members. It could involve regional initiatives, perhaps led by Arab states with relationships to both sides. An international trusteeship or monitoring system represents another possible mechanism. Under such a system, an international body would take responsibility for monitoring the import and use of construction materials, providing assurances to address security concerns while ensuring materials reach their intended civilian purposes. This would require agreement from all parties and sustained international commitment, both of which are challenging to secure. Some have proposed the concept of reconstruction zones, where specific areas would be designated for rebuilding under international supervision. Materials could enter these zones, and the construction process would be monitored to ensure compliance with agreed-upon guidelines. This would be a partial solution but might offer a practical way forward if a comprehensive agreement proves elusive. Longer-term solutions necessarily involve addressing the underlying political conflict. No amount of humanitarian intervention can provide lasting stability if the fundamental political issues remain unresolved. This brings us to questions about final status negotiations, two-state or alternative solutions, and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I want to be realistic here about the prospects for political resolution. The peace process as traditionally conceived has been moribund for years. The parties are as far apart as they have been in decades. The regional dynamics have shifted in ways that affect the conflict, with some Arab states normalizing relations with Israel without insisting on Palestinian statehood as a precondition. Yet, history suggests that situations that seem intractable can sometimes shift suddenly when underlying conditions change. We cannot predict exactly what might catalyze such a shift, but it's worth considering what factors could create openings for progress. Demographic and generational changes on both sides may eventually create new political dynamics. Economic integration in the region could create interests that favor stability. International pressure, if sustained and coordinated, can sometimes overcome resistance to change. Internal political changes within Israel or among Palestinian leadership could open new possibilities. Let me address now some of the arguments and counterarguments that circulate regarding the situation, because understanding the different perspectives is crucial to analyzing possible outcomes. Those who defend restrictions on construction materials argue from a security perspective. They point to documented cases of materials being diverted for military purposes, including extensive tunnel networks and fortifications. They argue that without restrictions, there would be even greater security threats, potentially leading to more violence and more casualties on both sides. This security argument isn't entirely without merit. There have been documented instances of dual-use materials being used for military purposes in Gaza. The tunnel networks are real, not fabricated. From a security perspective, there is a genuine dilemma about how to allow humanitarian needs to be met while preventing material diversion. However, critics of the restrictions make several counterarguments. First, they argue that the current approach of blanket restrictions is disproportionate, affecting an entire civilian population for the actions of armed groups. They contend that more targeted approaches could address security concerns without causing such extensive humanitarian harm. Second, critics argue that the restrictions are counterproductive even from a security perspective. By creating such desperate humanitarian conditions, they argue, the restrictions fuel radicalization and support for armed groups. A population with adequate shelter, economic opportunity, and hope for the future would be less likely to support violence. Third, there's an argument that the security rationale has been used to justify what is effectively collective punishment of a civilian population. International law prohibits collective punishment, and some legal analysts argue that blanket restrictions on materials needed for housing cross this line. From a humanitarian perspective, the arguments against restrictions are straightforward. People have a right to adequate shelter. The current situation violates basic humanitarian principles and human rights. Whatever the security concerns, there must be ways to address them that don't involve leaving 2 million people in deteriorating housing conditions. Let me explore now what might happen in various timeframes. In the immediate future, over the next few months, we're likely to see continued deterioration unless there's a dramatic intervention. More homes will become uninhabitable. Displacement will increase. Humanitarian organizations will struggle to meet growing needs with limited resources. There may be increased international attention if there's a particular catalyst, perhaps a specific tragic incident that captures media attention, or a report from a respected international organization that frames the situation in stark terms. Such attention could lead to renewed diplomatic efforts, though as we've seen before, attention doesn't automatically translate into effective action. In the medium term, over the next 1 to 3 years, several paths are possible. We could see a negotiated arrangement that allows for monitored delivery of construction materials. This would likely require a combination of international pressure and perhaps a change in political leadership on one or both sides, creating an opening for compromise. Alternatively, we could see continued stalemate, with the humanitarian situation persisting at catastrophic levels but not exploding into large-scale conflict. This seems unfortunately plausible given the pattern of recent years. The situation would continue to generate periodic international concern without producing sustained action. A third medium-term possibility is escalation into renewed major conflict. As I discussed earlier, the deteriorating humanitarian situation increases the risk of violence, and violence could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control it quickly. If this happens, we would see another cycle of destruction and attempted reconstruction, likely ending up worse than we started. In the longer term, over 5 to 10 years, the trajectory depends heavily on whether there's progress on the broader political conflict. If the underlying political issues remain unresolved, Gaza will likely continue to be a site of recurring humanitarian crisis and intermittent violence. Each cycle leaves conditions worse and makes eventual resolution harder. However, if there were political breakthroughs, whether a negotiated two-state solution, some form of confederation, or another political arrangement, then the specific issue of construction materials in Gaza could become part of a broader resolution. In this scenario, Gaza would need massive reconstruction and development investment, but such investment could be part of a peace dividend that transforms the situation. I want to spend some time now discussing what different actors could do if they wanted to improve the situation. These are practical steps that could be taken even without resolving the underlying conflict. Israel could implement a more targeted approach to restrictions, perhaps using technological solutions like tracking systems for materials, accepting international monitoring of material use, and distinguishing more clearly between materials that pose genuine security risks and those that don't. This would require political will and a willingness to accept some additional risk in exchange for humanitarian improvement, but it's technically feasible. Palestinian authorities in Gaza could commit to transparent accounting for all materials entering the territory, accept intrusive international monitoring if that's the price for access, and demonstrate through concrete actions that materials are being used for civilian purposes. This would require internal changes and might be politically difficult, but it's within their capacity. International actors, particularly the United States and European nations, could make the situation a higher diplomatic priority, perhaps linking their support for Israel to progress on humanitarian access. They could increase funding for humanitarian operations while simultaneously pushing for policy changes that would make that funding more effective. They could offer to provide monitoring services if that helps bridge trust gaps. Regional actors like Egypt could facilitate greater movement through border crossings while maintaining security cooperation with concerned parties. They could use their relationships with various Palestinian factions to encourage acceptance of monitoring arrangements. They could offer to host or mediate negotiations on technical arrangements for material transfer. Humanitarian organizations could continue documenting conditions, advocating for policy changes, and innovating in how they deliver services despite constraints. They could develop new approaches to shelter assistance that work within current restrictions while pushing for those restrictions to be eased. They could coordinate more effectively among themselves to maximize impact with limited resources. Let me address now some of the misconceptions and misunderstandings that often surround this issue, because clarity about what's actually happening is essential for productive discussion. One common misconception is that this is primarily a religious conflict. While religion plays a role in the identities and narratives on both sides, the core issues are political, territorial, and about competing national aspirations. The blocking of construction materials is a policy choice driven by security concerns, not religious doctrine. Another misconception is that the situation is completely symmetrical, that both sides bear equal responsibility and suffer equal consequences. While both sides have legitimate grievances and concerns, the asymmetry of power is real and affects the humanitarian impact. One side controls borders, airspace, territorial waters, and the flow of goods, while the other side is a stateless population living under blockade. Some people believe that simply lifting restrictions would immediately solve the housing crisis. In reality, even with full access to materials, reconstruction would take years and require massive funding that doesn't currently exist. The economic capacity to purchase materials and pay for construction has been degraded. Lifting restrictions is necessary but not sufficient. There's also sometimes a misconception that this is an issue that only affects Gaza. In reality, what happens in Gaza has implications for regional stability, international humanitarian norms, and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Solutions or continued crisis in Gaza affect prospects for peace more broadly. Let me discuss now the role of hope and pessimism in analyzing this situation. It's easy, given the pattern of recent years, to become deeply pessimistic about the prospects for improvement. The same issues recur. The same arguments are repeated. The suffering continues. From this perspective, the most likely outcome is simply more of the same, a grinding continuation of humanitarian crisis without resolution. However, historical perspective reminds us that situations that seem intractable can change. The Berlin Wall fell. Apartheid ended in South Africa. Peace came to Northern Ireland. These examples aren't meant to suggest that change in Gaza is imminent or easy, but rather to remind us that political situations are not fixed in stone. What might catalyze change in this situation? Internal political shifts in Israel could bring leaders more willing to take risks for peace or more willing to separate security concerns from humanitarian needs. Generational change in Palestinian leadership could create new approaches. International pressure could reach a tipping point where the costs of current policies outweigh perceived benefits. Regional dynamics could shift in ways that create new incentives for resolution. Economic changes could also be a factor. If there were ways to dramatically improve Gaza's economy, perhaps through special economic zones or international development projects, this could change the political calculus. People with economic opportunities and hope for the future are generally less likely to support violence, and this could reduce security threats while improving humanitarian conditions. Technological changes might offer new solutions to the dilemma of providing construction materials while addressing security concerns. Better monitoring technologies, tracking systems, and verification mechanisms could make it possible to ensure materials reach their intended uses without blanket restrictions. Let me turn now to the specific implications for different groups of people affected by this crisis. For families currently living in damaged homes or crowded with relatives, the implications are immediate and severe. They face daily risks from unstable structures. They lack privacy and dignity. Children cannot study properly or develop normally. Health suffers. The stress is constant and grinding. For children and young people in Gaza, the long-term implications are particularly concerning. Growing up without stable housing, with limited educational opportunities, in an environment of conflict and despair, affects development in profound ways. This generation has known nothing but crisis for their entire lives. The psychological and developmental impacts will shape Gaza's society for decades to come. For humanitarian workers trying to provide assistance, the blocking of construction materials makes their jobs incredibly difficult. They must try to address housing needs without access to the most basic materials. They face impossible triage decisions about who receives help and who doesn't. They work in an environment where their efforts, however heroic, cannot address the root causes of the crisis. For Israeli civilians living near Gaza, the situation also has implications. They live with security concerns and have experienced rocket fire and other threats from Gaza. Their legitimate security needs must be part of any solution. However, they also have an interest in long-term stability, which the current approach doesn't seem to be providing. For international observers and diplomats, this situation represents a test of the international system's ability to uphold humanitarian principles. If the international community cannot or will not act to ensure that civilians have access to basic shelter, what does that say about the strength of international humanitarian law and human rights norms? As we move toward the conclusion of this analysis, let me try to synthesize what we've discussed into an overall assessment of likely trajectories. The most probable near-term outcome is continued crisis without dramatic change. Homes will continue to deteriorate. Humanitarian conditions will remain severe. International attention will be sporadic. Some materials may trickle in through various channels, but not enough to meaningfully address the scale of need. This baseline scenario of continued crisis could persist for quite some time, unfortunately. It represents a kind of terrible equilibrium where no party has sufficient incentive to change course. Israel maintains restrictions citing security concerns. Palestinian authorities lack the leverage to force change. International actors provide just enough humanitarian assistance to prevent complete collapse but not enough to resolve the situation. However, this unstable equilibrium could be disrupted by various triggers. An escalation into renewed large-scale conflict is always possible, perhaps sparked by the deteriorating humanitarian situation or by other factors. Such escalation would likely produce more destruction, more displacement, and set back any progress even further. Alternatively, the equilibrium could be disrupted in a more positive direction by sustained international pressure, internal political changes, or creative diplomacy that finds ways to address both humanitarian needs and security concerns. This is less likely in the immediate term but becomes more probable over longer timeframes as conditions become increasingly untenable. What would a genuine solution look like? It would need to include several elements. First, a mechanism for allowing construction materials to enter Gaza with appropriate monitoring to address legitimate security concerns. Second, massive international funding for reconstruction, likely requiring billions of dollars in sustained investment. Third, steps toward addressing the underlying political conflict so that Gaza can transition from crisis management to genuine development. Such a solution would require compromise from all parties. Israel would need to accept more risk or more intrusive monitoring in exchange for humanitarian improvement. Palestinian authorities would need to accept restrictions on their sovereignty in the form of international oversight. International actors would need to commit substantial resources and diplomatic capital over a sustained period. The humanitarian imperative is clear. 2 million people deserve adequate shelter, basic services, and the opportunity to live in dignity. Whatever the security concerns, whatever the political complications, this fundamental human need remains. The blocking of construction materials when homes are collapsing represents a humanitarian crisis that demands action. The security concerns are also real and cannot be dismissed. Israel has faced genuine threats from Gaza, including rocket fire and tunnel infiltration. Any solution must address these concerns credibly. Security and humanitarian needs are not necessarily in opposition, though they are often framed that way. Creative diplomacy should be able to find approaches that address both. The political dimensions ultimately determine whether any solution is possible. Without progress on the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's hard to see how the specific situation in Gaza can be sustainably resolved. But waiting for comprehensive political resolution shouldn't mean allowing humanitarian catastrophe to continue unchecked. As I bring this analysis to a close, I want to emphasize several key points. First, the situation of homes collapsing while construction materials are blocked represents a severe humanitarian crisis affecting 2 million people. Second, this situation is likely to continue without significant changes in policy or political circumstances. Third, the consequences of continued crisis include not just immediate humanitarian suffering but long-term developmental, psychological, and political damage. Fourth, there are potential pathways to improvement, but they require political will, international engagement, and compromise from multiple parties. Fifth, the longer this situation continues, the harder it becomes to resolve, as damage accumulates and positions harden. Sixth, this crisis is both a humanitarian emergency and a political challenge, and addressing it effectively requires engaging with both dimensions. The international community has a choice to make. It can continue with the current approach of limited humanitarian assistance while the underlying crisis persists, essentially managing catastrophe rather than resolving it. Or it can decide that the humanitarian imperatives demand more forceful action, using diplomatic pressure, financial incentives, and creative problem-solving to find ways to address both humanitarian needs and security concerns. Thank you for your attention over these past hours as we've explored this complex and tragic situation together. The crisis in Gaza, symbolized by homes collapsing while materials to rebuild them are blocked, will continue to unfold in the days, weeks, and months ahead. How it unfolds depends on choices made by multiple actors with different interests and perspectives. The humanitarian needs are clear. The security concerns are real. The political challenges are substantial. But the imperative to act, to find solutions that honor both human dignity and legitimate security needs, remains. This is not just about Gaza. It's about what kind of international order we want to live in, what value we place on human rights and humanitarian principles, and whether we can find ways to break cycles of crisis that seem intractable. The answers to these questions will be written not just in policy documents and diplomatic communiques, but in the lived experiences of 2 million people whose homes and futures hang in the balance. Thank you.